over the planet, there are places scattered about that seem not to fit into any history textbook. Gigantic structures created by those whom we consider hunter-gatherers, wooden and stone idols that survived the Ice Age, statues without names, and fortified settlements without chronicles. All of this is like encrypted messages from the past, for which we still have not found the key. Scientists measure, compare, argue at conferences. For decades, articles are written and dissertations are defended. But the more data they collect, the more questions arise. Some mysteries upariots of stenu. There are simply no explanations, or we do not like them yet. Today, we will go on a journey not into legends and not into fairy tales, but into real archaeological finds. Everything that will be shown on the screen is only an illustration. It will help you imagine the scale. But the main thing here is the stories. You can listen to this video in the background before sleep, or just settle down comfortably in the evening when all your tasks are done. Let the outer world move a little to the side, and we will dive into the depths of time. And we will start where no one expected to see monumental art. Not in Egypt and not in Mesopotamia, but in the swamps of Siberia, with a wooden figure that peers at us across 12,000 years, older than the pyramids, the mystery of the Shigir idol. Imagine not a temple and not a pyramid, but an ordinary, at first glance, peat bog in the center of Russia. At the end of the 19th century, workers in the Shigir peat bog on the eastern slope of the Ural Mountains were simply extracting peat, fuel for stoves. Shovel after shovel, brown mass, water, roots. And then, suddenly, strange fragments of wood with carved lines and faces begin to appear from the mud. In the year 1890, no one suspected that in the hands of these people was one of the oldest known monuments in the world, made by humans right after the end of the Ice Age. When archaeologists cleaned and assembled all the found parts, a huge wooden figure rose up before them, carved from the trunk of a single tree. In its original form, the idol was more than 5 meters tall, roughly like a 2-story house. Below, a wide body, higher, an elongated face, and along the entire length, a whole code of lines, zigzags, and abstract signs. The most unsettling impression is produced by the faces. There is not one or two of them. There are several, arranged one above another. The eyes are empty, carved depressions. The nose and mouth are only indicated schematically, yet you still understand. These are human faces. They look straight at you across the millennia, calmly and somehow detached. The first analyses showed that the idol was about 9,000 years old. Even then, this seemed incredible. A wooden sculpture, enormous height, complex ornament, and all of this in an era when, as we were taught, people had barely moved away from caves and stone axes. Later, dating technologies became more precise, and the scientists were hit with a new blow. The age of the idol was pushed even further back, more than 12,000 years. It turns out that when the Egyptian pyramids did not exist, even as a concept, when no one had even dreamed of Stonehenge, somewhere at the foot of the Urals, there already stood a wooden monument as tall as a house. That epoch is called the Mesolithic, a time when the ice retreated, the first forests grew on the emptied lands, and people still lived by hunting and gathering. In the textbooks, these people look almost primitive. Campfires, hides, spears, but the Shigir idol forces us to revise this picture. If someone had a primitive everyday life, then their spiritual world was clearly very complex. Look at what we know for sure. A centuries-old tree trunk was chosen, not just some random little pine. The trunk was hewn and leveled. There are no accidental chips on it. The pattern of lines and zigzags stretches from top to bottom without gaps, like a text. Several faces are carefully distributed along the height of the figure. This is no longer accidental knife scratches. It is the work of people who clearly understood what exactly they wanted to depict. The idol is like a long scroll, only instead of letters, there are symbols and masks. What is this text? Here begins the part where archaeologists honestly spread their hands in uncertainty. There is a hypothesis that the idol shows a layered structure of the world. The top is the world of spirits and sky. The middle is the world of people. The bottom is the underworld. Zigzags and lines could mark the boundaries between these levels. Another version is that this is a warning or a boundary. For example, a huge pole idol could have stood on the border of a sacred place where one could not enter just like that. The faces from top to bottom could be guardian spirits or ancestors watching those who come here. It is easy for us to say, well, they drew some masks. For those people, this was perhaps the center of their world, the point where hunting, rituals, their ideas about death and about what comes after it all converged. The mere fact that a community of hunter-gatherers invested immense effort in such a figure already says a lot. They had to find a suitable tree, fell it with stone axes, process it, carve the ornament for weeks, drag and install this multi-meter column. No one would do this simply because there is nothing else to do. It is always the price for something very important, for a myth, for a ritual, for a shared belief. A separate mystery is how the idol survived to our days at all. Wood is a capricious material. It rots, burns, and falls apart in a matter of decades. The Shigir idol was lucky. It was either deliberately hidden in the swamp as a sacrificial object, or it simply fell into the peat over time. There, in the cold, oxygen-poor environment, the wood was almost preserved as in a can. Bacteria could not eat it, and the figure lay there for more than 10,000 years until humans once again pulled it out. Today, the idol has been restored from fragments, and part of it is still kept in a museum. But if we set aside display cases, dates, and academic articles, we are left with a simple fact. At the dawn of human history, someone already knew how to create huge symbolic objects and put thought and stories into them. We do not know which stories exactly. We do not understand the language of these lines. But it is obvious that this is not a random set of drawings, but a complex system whose meaning we have lost. The eyes of the idol, carved thousands of years ago, still look at us and remain silent. However, they are not the only silent witnesses of that epoch. A little further south, closer to the warm plains of the Near East, people of the same period decided to go even further. They began to create entire families of plaster figures, and from the very beginning they planned to bury them under the floor. The plaster people of Ain Ghazal, statues created to be hidden. On the outskirts of present-day Amman, the capital of Jordan, there's a place that was once called Ain Ghazal, Spring of the Gazelle. Today it is a chain of hills and streets, and several thousand years ago, it was one of the largest early farming settlements in the entire Near East. Long before the Egyptian pyramids, long before writing and royal dynasties, on the banks of a small river, people built rectangular houses from mud brick, smoothed the floors with lime plaster, sowed cereals, and kept goats and sheep. This was no longer a camp of hunters, but a real proto-city. Several thousand people, dense buildings, crafts, common rituals. In the 1980s, when a highway here was being widened, an excavator dug into ancient layers. Excavations began almost by accident, and very quickly it became clear that the archaeologists had stumbled upon something unusual. Under the floors of houses in carefully dug pits, there lay dozens of human figures made of reeds and plaster. In size, they were roughly like a child or a small adult, about 1 meter tall, some a little higher. These were not toys and not small idols, but full-size, for that time, statues. Thin necks, elongated faces, eyes, dark, emphasized with bitumen. Bodies that look slightly flattened, arms tightly pressed to the sides. Some have 2 heads on one body, as if 2 faces share a single life. But the strangest thing is not even their appearance, but their fate. Each of these statues, judging by the excavations, was made once and immediately buried. They were not placed in a corner of the house, not carried around during festivals. They were created, used in some rite, and then carefully buried, and the floor was laid over them again. Such one-time luxury for an ancient settlement is a huge expenditure of effort and resources. To make plaster, limestone must be heated to a temperature of around 800 degrees. This is not a campfire of 3 sticks. You need real kilns, lots of firewood, time, and skills. People in a semi-desert landscape spent wood not on heating and food, but on firing limestone for the sake of figures. Inside each statue, there's a framework of reed stalks, over which plaster is applied layer by layer, forming the features of the face, arms, and legs. Depth is given to the eyes with the help of a dark substance, bitumen. Sometimes traces of red pigment are found on the lips, and all this is done only in order to then lower the finished figure into a pit and cover it with earth. Who were they for those who created them? Again, there are many different versions. One of the most popular is that these are images of ancestors. The bodies of real deceased were buried under the floor, and sometimes their skulls were separated, covered with plaster, the facial features were drawn, and for some time they were kept separately as the presence of an ancestor in the house. Such skulls have already been found in other places in the Levant. The plaster statues of Ain Ghazal could be the next step in this tradition. Not only the skull, but the whole body, even if in a stylized form. Perhaps during some special rituals, these plaster people represented entire clans, protectors, founders of families, and then they were returned to the earth, as if closing the circle. Another version is that these are deities or guardian spirits, not specific people but symbols: fertility, rain, the success of the harvest. The two-headed figures are especially intriguing, 2 faces on one body. This can be read as a symbol of duality, life and death, sky and earth, past and future. All the hypotheses are united by one thing: scale and intention. For a settlement of early farmers to afford dozens of such statues, they had to organize the procurement of stone and wood, build kilns, train people in the craft, set aside time when men and women were not in the fields, not on the hunt, but making figures. This is no longer a small community, but a society in which common rituals and collective projects appear that go far beyond eating and surviving. It is also interesting how they were buried. The statues were not thrown in haphazardly. They were placed in pits in groups, carefully, sometimes vertically, sometimes laid side by side. Earth was poured on top, a new floor was laid, and life in the house continued. The inhabitants walked over these figures every day without seeing them, but most likely they remembered very well what exactly was hidden under their feet. You can imagine the elders telling children, "Here, under the floor, are our ancestors. Here are those who guard the house. Do not make noise, do not quarrel. Respect this corner." Today, the statues of Ain Ghazal are fragile, partially restored figures behind museum glass. But even in this state, they make an impression. You look into their large, dark eyes and understand that in front of you are some of the first attempts of humans to make a portrait of the soul, not of the body. There is still no writing, no theology, no canonical texts. But people are already trying to find a way to fix in material, something that cannot be touched with hands: memory, fear, hope, a sense of the future. And this brings them astonishingly close to us. We still depict those whom we are afraid to lose. We build monuments, put photographs on shelves, create memorials. The difference is only in material and technique, while the essence is the same. And now, let us move to another continent and climb much higher, where the air is already thin, and instead of plaster and wood, there is bare, volcanic stone. On one of the Andean plateaus, nature and perhaps humans together created a place where stones seem to have turned into faces and figures. And to this day, no one can decide once and for all whether this is just a play of imagination or traces of human hands that history has forgotten. The stone faces of the Marcahuasi Plateau. High in the Andes east of Lima, there's a place that seems to be only half carved out, like a rough draft of someone's grand design. This is the Marcahuasi Plateau, more than 4,000 meters above sea level. Bare volcanic rock, thin air, and an almost complete feeling that from here, you can no longer reach the world below. From above, everything looks almost boring. A gray plateau, rocks, low vegetation. But as soon as you come closer, the stones begin to play with your mind. One outcrop suddenly turns into a face with a long chin, another boulder into a sitting frog, a third into a lion with a massive mane, and whole rock walls into a gallery of profiles looking in different directions. The most famous of these formations receive the name Monument to Humanity. If you look from a certain angle, it seems that several human faces are imprinted in one rock, as if someone decided to carve an entire people from the mountain. Geologists, of course, explain everything simply. The plateau is made of volcanic tuff, a soft rock that easily crumbles and takes on bizarre forms under the influence of wind, rain, and temperature changes. Add to this the play of light and shadow, and our inborn desire to recognize faces in everything, and you get the classic effect of pareidolia. The brain itself draws what is not there. But on Marcahuasi, something else is strange: the number of such coincidences. The figures and profiles are not at every step, but there are enough of them that people have been arguing for decades whether nature created them alone or whether someone helped her. In the 1950s, the Peruvian researcher Daniel Russo literally fell in love with this plateau. He photographed, drew, and gave names: the face of the Inca, the African queen, the frog of fertility, the monument to humanity. Russo was convinced that this was the legacy of an unknown, very ancient civilization that allegedly decided to leave humanity a stone message. Scholars treated such ideas cautiously, to put it mildly. But the photos themselves spread around the world, and Marcahuasi turned into a place of power for lovers of mysteries. It is important to understand that this is not just bare stone around. On the plateau and along its edges, real archaeological remains have been found: stone terraces, building ruins, small burials. From the ceramics and other finds, it is clear people lived here and performed rituals long before the Incas. The plateau was part of a network of sacred places used by early Andean cultures. Why did they need such an inconvenient balcony at a height of 4,000 meters? The answer is simple: for rituals. For many Andean peoples, mountains are living beings, spirits, masters of rain, fertility, and luck. Shrines were often built at heights where it is easier to reach the sky. The movement of the sun and moon is better seen. The horizon is clearer. The feeling is stronger that you stand on the boundary of worlds. If people climbed Marcahuasi for ceremonies, and around them there were already stones that resembled animals and people, it is no surprise that these forms became overgrown with myths and meanings. It is quite possible that some of the figures were slightly corrected by hand: a line of an eye, the shape of a chin, a nose emphasized. Thousands of years of erosion would have smoothed such details, and today we cannot distinguish where nature ends and a light human accent begins. This is the main intrigue of Marcahuasi. Geology explains a lot, archaeology confirms that people lived and prayed here, but you can no longer draw a clear line between it formed by itself and it was made. For the ancient inhabitants of the Andes, this question would not even exist. In their worldview, a stone could be at the same time a natural object, a living spirit, and the work of the hands of ancestors or gods. What mattered was not the way it appeared, but the role in the ritual. Today, when clouds race swiftly over the plateau, shadows glide across the rocks, and in a couple of minutes the profile of a face turns back into an ordinary boulder, it is easy to understand why this place hooked both researchers and fans of mysticism so much. Marcahuasi feels like a test of how strongly we want to see the past, the way it is interesting to us, and not the way it really was. But if on this plateau a dispute is being played out between nature and imagination, then our next story is about the power of nature, with which absolutely no one can argue. It is a story of a flood that almost washed one of the cradles of ancient Egypt out of history. The flood in Hierakonpolis. When the Nile stepped out of its role as the good god. When we say ancient Egypt, pyramids, Luxor, and Tutankhamun spring to mind. But long before that, cities had already grown along the banks of the Nile, no less significant than the future Thebes. One of them is Hierakonpolis, ancient Nekon, about 100 kilometers north of Aswan. It was a megacity of its time. The settlement grew from a small village already around the 4th millennium BCE. In time, it occupied more than 100 hectares. Several thousands of people lived there. Here, beer was brewed in giant breweries, ceramics was fired, jewelry was made, and the elite was buried in large necropolises. The temple complex of Hierakonpolis, even before the unification of Egypt, was the largest religious center in Upper Egypt. It was here that the famous Narmer palette was found, a stone slab with reliefs on which the king unites Upper and Lower Egypt. So Hierakonpolis stood at the very origins of Egyptian statehood, at the point where the power of the pharaohs was born out of scattered communities. And now imagine, the city lives, grows, builds houses according to the usual scheme near the river. And at some moment, the Nile decides to show that he is the one in charge here. During excavations, archaeologists noticed a strange layer. Between cultural levels lies a thick, uniform layer of silt and clay, inside which there are fragments of walls, overturned vessels, skewed foundations, tools that look as if they were left behind in great haste. These are not traces of the usual annual flooding of the Nile. The Egyptians knew perfectly well how to use and control that. Here we can see a catastrophe. The water came higher than usual, stronger and more destructive. Part of the houses was simply undermined. Somewhere the walls tilted and collapsed. Somewhere the floors ended up under a layer of silt. In workshops, they found kilns with half-fired ceramics frozen inside them, as if the craftsmen dropped everything and ran when the water was already climbing into the doorways. No written chronicles of this event have survived from that time. It was an era before writing. But the earth itself tells the story no worse than scribes. The Nile, which had given life, once stepped out of its habitual bed and, with that same force, struck the city that depended on him. What is interesting is what happened next. On top of the layer of silt and destruction, archaeologists see new buildings. The city was not abandoned. It began to be restored, but in a different way. Houses stopped being built in the lowest places. Some quarters shifted upward. Sacred zones, temples, and important buildings were more and more often located on elevations, out of reach of any possible future flood. In essence, this is one of the first recorded examples in history of how a natural disaster forces people to reconsider urban planning. For the Egyptians, water was always a symbol of both life and chaos. In myths, the world is born out of primeval waters, but those same waters can swallow everything again. The experience of Hierakonpolis, when a new city is born from silt and rubble, was surely reflected in religion and rituals in one form or another. How severe that particular flood was, we will never know. How many people died? How many families lost their homes? But we see that people did not move away to some safer place far from the river. They remained nearby. They simply learned to live with the risk by climbing a little higher. This fine balance between river blessing and river threat would become the hallmark of all Egyptian civilization for thousands of years. And while on the Nile's banks, people quietly rebuilt their homes, thousands of kilometers away, other peoples tried to explain a no less frightening phenomenon: a fire that once appeared in the sky above their mountains. The fiery sky over the lands of the Chachapoya. Meteor, comet, or omen. Northern Peru is not only coastline and deserts, but also mountain jungles where clouds catch on peaks and villages sit right on narrow ridge crests. This is where the Chachapoya lived, a people whom the Spaniards later called the warriors of the clouds. They built fortresses at heights where ordinary people's heads already spin. One of the most famous is Cuelap, huge stone walls, dozens of round houses, a complex system of terraces. On steep cliffs, their stone sarcophagi still sit, elongated figures with human faces looking into the chasms. The Chachapoya resisted the Incas for a long time, and then together with them faced the Spaniards. And from those times, besides ruins and burials, we have records of chroniclers who pass down local legends and memories. In some of these texts, a story about fire in the sky appears, not about a mythological god, but about an event that, according to the locals, the ancestors saw. The description in different versions varies slightly, but the essence is similar. A huge fiery object suddenly appeared in the sky. It lit up the night as if it were day. It was accompanied by noise and rumbling. In some accounts, it rushed by and disappeared behind the mountains. In others, it supposedly fell somewhere in the remote ranges. For peoples who already lived in a world full of spirits of mountains, forests, and mists, such a picture was something beyond imaginable. No wonder that the event was remembered and came to be seen as a sign, a warning, or punishment. From the point of view of modern science, there are several explanations. A large meteor or bolide exploding in the atmosphere, a bright comet, the distant glow of major volcanic activity. The most plausible is a meteor. Even in our own time, when we understand the physics of the process, phenomena like the Tunguska explosion or the Chelyabinsk meteor cause shock. And in a world with no telescopes, no science, not even simple maps, it becomes a 100% message from the heavens. What is important is that the chroniclers recorded this story not as a myth about ancient gods, but as something the elders told. That is, as if it were a memory of a real event passed through several generations. The Chachapoya paid close attention to the sky. Their fortresses and shrines are built into the landscape so that the view of mountains, valleys, and stars is part of the overall composition. For them, the sky was not just a background, but an active participant in the world. You can imagine how after that night above their mountains, shamans explained what had happened in the language of spirits. Elders searched for a sign in it of war, epidemic, or famine. And children then told their children, once the sky lit up with fire. Thus, the memory of a single celestial event could easily survive until the Spaniards arrived and, through them, reach us. But if that was only a flash, an instant remembered for centuries, then our next mystery is about a disappearance that took place slowly and quietly. The disappearance of an entire military unit that vanished in such a way that to this day, it is unclear where and how it died. The Lost Ninth Legion, a legend of the Roman army. The Roman army was famous for its careful attitude toward its paperwork. Legions were recorded in lists, their movements noted in inscriptions, their victories in chronicles. Against this background, one case looks especially strange. The Ninth Legion Spanish simply dissolved in history. It is assumed that its roots go back to the time of Julius Caesar. Units with the number 9 took part in the conquest of Gaul and in battles of the civil wars. Later, the legion served in Hispania, for which it received the honorary cognomen Hispana, Spanish. By the beginning of the 1st century CE, the 9th ended up in Britain. Rome had only just fixed its presence on the island. Decades of heavy campaigns against tribes in the north and west lay ahead. In the 60s and 61st years CE, one of the most famous uprisings on the island takes place. The revolt of the Iceni tribe, led by the Queen Boudica. Roman towns burn, colonies are massacred, and the 9th Legion tries to come to the aid of Camulodunum, present-day Colchester. According to Tacitus, the legion falls into an ambush and loses almost all of its infantry. Only the cavalry escapes. The honor of the 9th is smeared in blood, but it is not disbanded. It is refilled with new recruits and continues serving in Britain. Its base is Eboracum, modern York, an important strongpoint on the northern border of the province. Then, silence in the chronicles. We see the legion's stamps on bricks, inscriptions with its name, evidence of its presence. And then, roughly after the beginning of the 2nd century CE, the trail disappears. In novels and films, the most dramatic version was born. The 9th allegedly marched north, beyond the future line of Hadrian's Wall, and there it was completely destroyed by tribes. A beautiful picture. the legion disappears into the mists of Scotland, leaving behind only a legend. Archaeology does indeed show that Roman forts in Scotland experienced assaults and fires. But another thing is strange. If an entire legion had died in one enormous slaughter, some Roman author would likely have written about it. The death of 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest under Varus is described in detail by the sources. The scale of the disaster was too great to be hushed up. With the 9th, everything is different. After a certain moment, it is simply no longer mentioned in the lists. Another legion takes its place in York. There are no documents about a massive defeat. From here comes another version. The 9th may have been transferred from Britain to another dangerous section of the frontier, say, closer to the Rhine or eastward, to the border with Parthia or restless Judea. There, it could have suffered heavy losses in several campaigns, gradually dissolved, been replenished with men from other units, or simply quietly disbanded. Supporting this, some artifacts have been found in Europe that possibly link to the 9th after its probable departure from Britain. But there is no direct, ironclad proof. And there is a third, more mundane hypothesis. The legion suffered too many losses. Its name became associated with misfortune, and the authorities decided simply to get rid of the unlucky number by redistributing the remaining soldiers among other units. Whatever the case, the fact remains, by the middle of the 2nd century, a legion with that number and cognomen does not appear anymore. For an army that prides itself on tradition, this is, in itself, strange. And now let us move into a world that was separated from Rome not only by an ocean, but by an enormous gap in our historical picture. There, in a late pre-Columbian tomb, a small clay head was found that simply should not have been there. The bearded head from Mexico, an artifact out of place. Central Mexico, the area around modern Toluca. In the 1930s, archaeologists were investigating the ruins of a small pre-Columbian mountain settlement. A typical site of the late period, houses, pottery, burials with grave goods, everything fits what you would expect for that time. And then, in one of the graves, among ceramics, textiles, ornaments, bells, and beads, dated approximately to the 13th, 15th centuries CE, there lay a small item, a clay head about the size of a fist. At first glance, it seemed to be an ordinary figurine, but on closer inspection, the archaeologist's jaws practically dropped. The head depicts a bearded man, not a stylized mask-like face, as in local traditions, but fairly realistic features. A long nose, deep eye sockets, a neat beard. And it is the beard that changes everything. In pre-Columbian Mesoamerican art, bearded figures are practically unheard of. The local peoples simply did not have such dense facial hair growth as, for example, the inhabitants of the Mediterranean. People were depicted clean-shaven with smooth cheeks, or otherwise, but not like this. Here, however, the face is much more reminiscent of Roman or Hellenistic terracotta figurines. It is as if a small stranger had ended up among local things. The archaeologist José García Payón, who led the excavations, recorded everything in detail. But at that time, there was no sensation. Only decades later, when his reports were revisited, did it become clear what question was hanging in the air. What is this head doing in a pre-Columbian grave? The context was clean. The grave had not been disturbed in modern times. All the surrounding items were clearly local. The layer was undisturbed. There were no signs of European intrusion. So the head had been placed in the burial, along with the other gifts, when no one had yet heard of Columbus. Later, it was examined using thermoluminescent dating. The result gave an interval from the 1st millennium BCE to the Middle Ages CE. That is, at the very least, the item is indeed ancient and not a modern fake. At the same time, the clay is not local to this region, but it also does not match unambiguously any specific samples from the Mediterranean. The style is very similar to Roman, but there is no one known series of figurines that it absolutely matches. And here begins the most interesting part, the theories. A random traveler across the ocean. Supporters of this idea suggest that some Roman or Mediterranean ship might have either ended up in the ocean and sunk, or, after breaking apart, had several objects carried far across the Atlantic by currents. One of these artifacts could by some miracle reach Mesoamerican traders through a chain of exchanges and then end up in a burial. It is hard to believe, but in theory, ocean currents and human actions sometimes do create wonders. A later intrusion layer. Skeptics propose that the head might have arrived already after colonization, and that for some reason, the grave's base was not recognized as disturbed. But then again arises the question: how did a European object end up so deep and so neatly inserted into an ancient layer without the typical signs of disturbance? A local work made from a foreign prototype. Another option is that some craftsman got hold of an exotic object with a foreign face, possibly already imported from the old world afterwards, and tried to copy what he saw, creating a head in an unusual style for the region. But then the problem of the burial context and datings emerges once more. The main problem is that this is a single find. If there had been other clearly Mediterranean objects lying next to it, coins, glass beads, amphora fragments, the picture would look very different. But there is nothing else. One single head. Small, silent, bearded. It certainly does not overturn the entire history of contacts between the old and new worlds, as sensational headlines sometimes like to claim. To talk about real Roman voyages to America, a completely different volume of evidence is needed. But it is not easy to dismiss it either as a simple excavation mistake or a funny coincidence. The discovery report is detailed. The context is recorded. The item has been checked by physical methods. It does not look like a fake. As a result, the head from Chachapoya, the actual name of the settlement, has hung in a strange status, too serious to ignore, and too lonely to build a revolution in science upon it. Such finds remind us that our history is not a smooth, sealed book. There are pasted-in random pages in it that we do not yet know where to insert, and sometimes one small clay head looks out from a grave deeper than an entire volume of academic works. In all of these stories, there is a common motif. These are real finds and real places, not legends from old books. The artifacts lie in museums, cities are being excavated by expeditions, layers and dates are checked by different methods. But even so, much remains beyond explanation. We can measure, analyze, and make a map. And still in the very center, there will be a question with no precise answer. The honest answer of science here usually sounds like this: we have versions, but we do not have a final solution. And perhaps that is exactly why such stories are so captivating. As long as we do not know, we still have room for questions, for curiosity, and for that very feeling for which it is interesting at all to watch videos like this. The sense that the world is much more complicated and strange than what we are told in school textbooks. And the most intriguing part is that this is far from a complete list of the mysteries of antiquity. Away from all these stories, in the mountains of Afghanistan, there is yet another city carved from stone where Greek architecture and Eastern traditions once intertwined, and then it disappeared from the maps, so that it was long taken for a myth. But that is already a topic for another episode. If you have watched to this moment, you are that very person who is not afraid of long stories and difficult questions. Write in the comments which of the mysteries in this episode hooked you the most. The idol in the swamp, the plaster statues, the Ninth Legion, or the bearded head. And if you want more similar interesting episodes, let us know about it in the comments. And right now, watch our previous releases, which have already appeared on your screen. Thank you for watching and subscribe to the Top Facts channel.